Sometime between one decade and the next, the country you grew up in quietly rearranged itself. The faces that had been on your street every week went somewhere, and you got on with things the way you always did. There are 21 jobs in this video, scattered across pit heads and doorsteps, typing pools and factory gates, all over the country. All of it was real, none of it is coming back. Section 1, the Coleman noise, was the thing you noticed first, not the lorry pulling up outside, though you heard that too. A low diesel grumble that ran through the window frames if you were standing close enough. What announced him properly was the coal itself hitting the bottom of the coal hole, a tremendous crack and cascade that went through the whole ground floor of the house, like something had fallen from a height. Your mother had been preparing since she heard him calling in the street. Furniture pushed back from the hall, newspaper laid across the floor in overlapping sheets, the curtain at the bottom of the stairs tied up out of the way. And then the Coleman himself, coming through your front door, a 100-weight sack bowing his back, black from his hands to his collar, wearing a leather waistcoat with straps across the chest that old Coleman called a backskin, something between armor and a saddle, made in the same workshops that had been supplying the trade since before your grandmother was born. Coal had heated British homes for so long that the houses themselves were built around receiving it. Victorian and Edwardian terraces came with a coal hole under the stairs, a low storage space accessible through a door, tight enough that the coalman had to crouch and turn sideways to shoot the sack in. If your house had a cellar, the coal went down through a chute in the pavement, a metal-hinged flap that lifted flush from the street and dropped into the dark below. You could feel the impact through the floor when a full sack went in. In blocks of flats above the ground floor, the coalman charged extra for the climb. Accounts from the Notting Hill Council estates in the late 1940s record residents on upper floors being expected to tip a shilling per 100-weight bag for the additional carrying. A shilling was real money. If you didn't produce it, the coalman remembered, and next time the delivery came a little later, and the knock on the door a little quieter. Between a coalman and his round, there was a relationship that sounds improbable now. Customers left their keys under the mat, or in the usual place behind the dustbin, or simply left the door unlocked. He let himself in, found the coal hole or the cellar or the store under the kitchen stairs, shot the sack, and let himself back out. Nothing was taken. No one expected anything to be. A coalman who worked the Norwich area from the late 1940s through into the 1970s recalled that his customers trusted the delivery men completely, that the milkman, the breadman, and the coalman all moved through the same houses on the same streets, treating the access as a responsibility and returning it undisturbed. That was the arrangement of the doorstep trade, and it ran without a written contract or a clause in any agreement. You left the door open, and the house was the same when you came home. Carrying a 100-weight sack meant carrying 112 pounds on your back, not on a trolley, not with mechanical assistance, but on your shoulders and across that leather backskin, from the lorry to wherever in the house the coal needed to go. A full winter round meant moving dozens of sacks a day across the same ground. One former coalman who worked for Charrington's at their Wood Green depot described drinking gallons of milk daily on heavy loads to lay the dust in his lungs, and said the backskin was the only thing standing between the work and a wrecked spine by 50. On formal employment records, the job was classified as unskilled labor, which kept the wages low. The men who did it disagreed with that classification, though not in any document. Pricing was seasonal. Coal sold by the hundredweight, the price rising in autumn as demand built and dropping in summer when the fires were out and the round went quiet. Many coalmen were laid off entirely in the warmer months and came back in September. Summers were time on your hands and not much else. Decline was already underway before the 1970s arrived, and the decade finished it across most of the country. Two forces came at the trade simultaneously, and neither one left any room for recovery. The first was the Clean Air Act of 1956, reinforced and extended by a second act in 1968, which designated smokeless zones across British towns and cities and banned the burning of raw coal within their boundaries. Coalmen in those zones shifted to delivering anthracite and manufactured smokeless substitutes, cleaner to burn but more expensive and less habitual. People who might have kept a coal fire running out of preference found the decision being made for them by the local authority. By 1967, though, the more fundamental change had begun. Exploratory drilling in the British sector of the North Sea had found the West Sole gas field in 1965, and within 2 years, the government had launched one of the largest peacetime infrastructure programs in British history, the conversion of every gas appliance in the country from town gas to natural gas. Region by region, across a program that ran from 1967 to 1977, engineers came to homes and converted approximately 40 million appliances. As each region completed the switch, the economics of coal heating changed permanently. Gas central heating required no delivery, no storage, no coal hole, no preparation, no newspaper on the floor, no arranging of furniture around a man with a heavy sack and dust on his boots. The coal hole under the stairs became a cupboard for the vacuum cleaner. The bunker in the backyard became a planter, or a place to keep paint tins. Nobody had to make a decision to stop using coal. They just found, one winter, that they already had. Coalmen continued working into the 1980s, and some into the 1990s. Loyal to rural customers and older households, the gas program had never fully reached. But as a profession woven into every street and every delivery schedule in every town in Britain, the trade was gone by the late 1970s. There was no announcement and no ceremony marking the end. You remember the newspaper on the floor. You remember being told not to touch the coal hole door because your hands would be black before lunch. You remember the coalman moving through the house without pausing or looking around, knowing exactly where to go, and being gone before the last sheet of newspaper had finished settling. Nobody had to explain any of it. That was simply how the house worked. You've just seen how two of Britain's most familiar delivery trades ran on trust, routine, and a knock at the door that needed no explanation. Coming up next, there's a job that arrived at your house once a week, carrying something that gave your whole family a reason to argue on a Saturday afternoon, and the man who brought it was probably your neighbor. Section 2. The Milkman. Before the street woke up, before the first alarm in any house on the road had gone off, you could already hear it. Not an engine in the usual sense, not the growl of anything burning fuel, but a low electric whine, and the rattling percussion of glass bottles knocking against each other in their wire crates. If you were a light sleeper, or if you happened to be awake for some reason at 4:30 in the morning, that sound was the first thing the day gave you. It meant the float was on your street. By the time you had rolled over and gone back to sleep, 2 pints in glass bottles with foil tops had appeared on your doorstep, quiet as a delivery could be made, and the float had moved on. The milk float in the 1970s was as close to a purpose-built machine as the doorstep trade ever produced. It was electrically powered, open on both sides, with no door between the driver and the road, low and flat-bedded, built specifically for a job that required stopping every 30 yards and stepping off without closing anything behind you. Wales and Edwards of Shrewsbury built them. Morrison Electricar of South Wigston in Leicestershire, a company that traced its origins back to the 1890s, built them. Victor Electrics of Southport built them from 1923. By the time the trade reached its peak in the mid-1970s, there were more than 40,000 of these floats registered and working across Britain, and annual production at the manufacturers was running at around 2,000 units a year. You did not need to see one to know where it was. The sound of the bottles told you. At the height of the doorstep era, in 1975, around 94% of all milk consumed in Britain arrived this way, in glass bottles on the step, collected the same day for washing and refilling. The bottles came back because returning them was part of the arrangement, and the arrangement was total. You left the empties out. The milkman collected them, left the full ones, marked his book, moved on. If you needed an extra pint or wanted to stop a delivery while you were away, there was a note, not a phone call, not an account adjustment online, a note under one of the empties. The milkman read it and acted on it, and the system worked because the same man came to the same step on the same days, for years at a stretch. People said they knew the milkman the way they knew the postman, which is to say they knew his routine better than they knew most of their neighbors. The round started in the middle of the night and covered between 40 and 50 streets before breakfast. On a busy round, a milkman might shift several hundred pints in a single morning, stepping on and off the float in a rhythm that one photographer who spent time documenting the last working floatmen in Britain described as something close to choreography, an automatic sequence of step, lift, set down, step back, move on, that the body learned and then performed without the head needing to be involved at all. Milkmen talked to their customers. They saw children born and watched them leave home. They knew who was ill because the order had gone down to 1 pint for the first time in 30 years, and nobody had cancelled it, and they knocked to check. Nobody told them to do that. It was simply what the job was. The Milk Marketing Board, set up by Act of Parliament in 1933 to stabilise prices and ensure every farmer a guaranteed buyer, underpinned the whole structure. It meant the price of milk was regulated, the supply was assured, and the economics of a doorstep round made sense. Dairies could plan their fleets, their routes, their staffing, against a fixed and predictable cost base. That stability lasted 40 years. Supermarkets began undercutting doorstep prices from the late 1970s onwards, offering milk in plastic containers at a fraction of what a doorstep pint cost to deliver. The calculation was simple, and it was never going to resolve in the milkman's favour. Delivering individual glass bottles to individual steps across 50 streets before dawn cost money in labour, in float maintenance, in the washing and reuse of the bottles themselves, and in the coordination of a round that had to absorb every change in every household's order week by week. Buying 4 pints in a plastic jug at the supermarket, while you were already there, cost almost nothing extra in effort, and significantly less in cash. By the time the Milk Marketing Board was dissolved in 1994, doorstep delivery had already fallen to around half the market it once held. By 2010, it had fallen to 8%. By 2016, it was 3%. The floats themselves barely exist now. Fewer than 400 are still in milk service across the whole country, and the manufacturers who built them at 2,000 units a year in 1970 have long since closed or moved into other vehicles entirely. No new milk floats are being made. The mechanics who know how to service the surviving ones are growing old, and when they retire, that knowledge goes with them. What you remember, if you grew up in Britain in the 1970s, is the sound of it in the dark, that particular rattle of glass on glass, getting louder and then passing and fading down the street. You could set a clock by it. You didn't need to. That was simply how the morning worked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how 2 of Britain's most familiar delivery trades ran on trust, routine, and a knock at the door that needed no explanation. Coming up next, there's a job that arrived at your house once a week, carrying something that gave your whole family a reason to argue on a Saturday afternoon. And the man who brought it was probably your neighbour. Section 3. The Football Pools Collector Saturday was the day that mattered, but Thursday evening was when he came to the door. You might not have known his name, though your parents almost certainly did, because in many streets he was not a stranger at all. He was 3 houses down, or he worked with your father at the factory, or he was the man from the corner who had taken on the round as a second income on top of whatever his regular job was. He came up the path with a leather satchel and a clipboard, collected the filled-in coupon from the previous week, along with the stake money for the following one, left a blank coupon for next Saturday's fixtures, made a mark in his book, and moved on to the next house. The whole transaction took less than 2 minutes. He did this across every house on his street, and the next street, and the one after that, 2 evenings a week in any weather, finishing well after dark on a school night. And then he started again the following week. The football pools had been running since the 1920s. John Moores launched Littlewoods in Liverpool in February 1923 after printing 4,000 coupons and distributing them outside Old Trafford before a winter match, with results so poor that only 35 came back, yielding a total stake of £4 and 7 shillings and sixpence. Vernon's followed in 1925, also out of Liverpool. Zetta's arrived in London in 1933. By the end of the Second World War, the pools accounted for around 15 million postal packets every single week. And by the 1950s, more than 100,000 people were working across the industry in some capacity. Littlewoods introduced its door-to-door collector service formally in 1957. though the practice of direct collection had been part of the business model far earlier. The collector was the front edge of an organization that ran from individual streets all the way up through main collectors, area managers, and regional concessionaires, each layer taking a cut of the coupons handled beneath them. The collector's fee was 12.5% of every stake he collected. It was not a salary. There was no contract, no sick pay, no holiday entitlement, no pension arrangement. It was commission, paid on what you brought in, which meant your earnings tracked your round. A reliable collector who kept his customers happy and turned up every week, regardless of whether it was raining, or whether he had already worked a full day at Marconi's, or the Printworks, or wherever his main job was, could build a round large enough to make the effort genuinely worthwhile. One former concessionaire, who covered North Birmingham across into Wales in the late 1970s, described overseeing more than 1,000 individual collectors at the peak of the operation, each working their own cluster of streets, each paid on the same commission model, none of them on a formal employment contract with Littlewoods. The structure was vast, and it was almost entirely invisible, assembled from neighbors doing a favor that happened to pay. What the collector sold was a specific kind of gambling that never quite called itself gambling. You filled in your coupon by predicting the outcomes of that weekend's football fixtures, earning 3 points for a score draw, 2 for a no-score draw, 1.5 for an away win, 1 for a home win. You aimed for the treble chance, which Littlewoods had introduced in 1946, and which became the game's defining format, requiring you to identify 8 score draws from the listed matches. The skill, or the feeling of skill, was the point. You were not simply picking a horse and watching it run. You were applying knowledge, reading form, using judgment. The pools felt like an investment to the people who played them weekly, a reasonable and disciplined use of a shilling or two, nothing like the races or the betting shop. In February 1971, an 18-year-old from Coventry named Sandra Bombroff shared a prize of £36,929 with her employer, Vera Fellows. In today's money, that prize was worth more than £500,000. The collector who knocked on their door on the Thursday before that result came in had no idea he was carrying it. The collector himself often played. He was a customer as well as a representative, filling in his own coupon alongside the ones he handled for everyone else, dropping it into the same batch he would carry to the regional office before the Friday deadline. There was a social texture to the round that a postal-only system could never replicate. He knew who was on a run of bad luck and who had come close the previous fortnight. He knew who always wanted to discuss the fixtures and who left the coupon on the doorstep because they were putting the children to bed. He was a weekly presence with a specific and understood purpose, and the neighborhood organized itself lightly around his schedule the way it organized itself around the bin collection or the market day. The National Lottery arrived in November 1994 and changed the calculation overnight. Where the pools asked for prediction and patience and a week's wait, the lottery asked for nothing except £1 and a ticket, with results on a Wednesday and a Saturday, available at every newsagent in the country, without anyone needing to come to your door. The pools could not compete with that simplicity, and they did not. The collector's round shrank first, then became uneconomic, then stopped. By the end of the 1990s, the door-to-door model that had sustained the industry for 7 decades was effectively finished across most of Britain. What remained was the memory of Thursday evenings, the satchel, the 2 minutes on the doorstep, and the coupon left on the hall table with the pen beside it, ready for Saturday. There's a job that required no union card and no apprenticeship at all, just a leather bag, a clipboard, and the kind of persistence that meant going out in the rain on a Wednesday evening when you had already worked a full day at something else entirely. Section 4. The Telegram Boy. The feeling started before the door opened. You saw him from the window, or someone in the street saw him, and the word traveled faster than he could walk, because a telegram boy, coming up a garden path in Britain, carried a weight entirely out of proportion to the small envelope in his hand. In wartime, that weight had been absolute, and everyone knew it. A uniformed figure on a bicycle turning into your street meant something had happened to someone, and the seconds between spotting him and establishing which door he was heading for could rearrange everything. By the 1970s, the wars were long over, but the dread had not fully left. It had attached itself to the uniform and the bicycle and the knock, and it stayed there until you read the thing and found it was a birthday greeting from an uncle in Dundee, or the time and platform number for a train connection. Then the relief was as physical as the fear had been. You laughed at yourself for it, later. The telegram boy in Britain was a creature of the General Post Office, which had taken over inland telegraph operations from the railways and private companies in 1870, and inherited with them the whole apparatus of messenger delivery. He was expected to look the part. A blue instruction book was to be carried at all times and produced on request. Rules covered his hair, which was to be kept short, his appearance, which was to be clean, and his conduct, which was to be courteous to anyone he encountered, regardless of the circumstances. He was forbidden from sliding down staircase handrails. He was forbidden from smoking, gambling, or playing cards while in uniform. He was not to enter public houses except for the sole purpose of making a delivery. He was, in effect, expected to conduct himself as someone who wore the uniform of the Crown, because officially, that is precisely what he was doing. The vehicle changed over the decades. Early messenger boys went on foot or by bicycle, covering the ground at whatever pace their legs could manage. By the 1930s, the post office had introduced motorcycles for longer deliveries. Then in December 1948 came the machine that defined the job for an entire generation of postal workers, the BSA Bantam, a 125cc two-stroke that became the GPO's standard delivery motorcycle and stayed in that role through the following 2 decades. BSA supplied 460 Bantams to the post office in 1955, another 460 in 1956, 641 in 1957. The deliveries continued through the late 1960s. In the memories of people who grew up watching for the telegram boy, it is almost always a small, slightly buzzing motorcycle that they picture, often red in their recollection, because red was the GPO's color, though standard Bantams came in light green, and the red ones were a specific post office specification. The noise of the engine cutting out at your gate was as much a part of the telegram experience as the paper inside the envelope. What the envelope contained was a strip or strips of ticker tape-style text, the message transmitted electrically from the sending post office and printed out at the receiving end, then pasted onto a standard form and folded for delivery. The technology behind this was Victorian, and it had never needed to be replaced because it worked. You went to the post office counter, paid by the word, and the message arrived at its destination within hours, by any standard that the postal service before the telegraph would have considered miraculous. At their peak in the middle of the 20th century, around 15 million telegrams were sent annually in the United Kingdom. By the mid-1960s, that number had dropped to around 10 million a year, as telephone ownership spread and long-distance calls became cheaper and more reliable. The decline of the telegram boy followed directly from the decline of the telegram itself. If fewer messages were being sent, fewer boys were needed to deliver them. The post office made the decision in 1977 to plan for the service's abolition, though it took another 5 years to execute. By then, the telegram had split from the post office entirely. British Telecom, newly separated from the postal service, took on the telegraph operation, and then announced on the 19th of October 1981 that the service would be discontinued. On the 30th of September 1982, after 139 years of continuous operation in the United Kingdom, the telegram ended. A replacement called the telemessage launched the following month, taking messages by telephone and delivering them by post the next day, which was faster than a letter, but not faster than a phone call, and the distinction it offered over ordinary correspondence was never quite enough to make it stick. What went with the telegram was something harder to define than a communication technology. Telegrams had a physical authority that other messages lacked. The fact that someone had gone to the counter and paid by the word, had chosen each word deliberately because every extra one cost money, and had then sent that compressed, weighted thing out across the wires to arrive at your door in the hands of someone in uniform, gave the contents a seriousness that a phone call could not quite replicate and an email never would. Wedding telegrams were read aloud at receptions. Telegrams from employers confirmed postings and appointments. The form itself was an event, separate from whatever information it carried. The telegram boy, who knocked on your door in 1974, was doing a job that had been done the same way since before your grandparents were born. By 1982, there was no one left to knock. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how a piece of paper the size of a shopping receipt could stop a whole street in its tracks, and how the boy carrying it knew exactly what that meant every time he turned into a garden path. Next, there's a job that worked the other end of the journey, the person who got you onto the bus and made sure you paid for the privilege. Section 5. The bus conductor. Summer heat was the test. The upper deck of a double-decker in July, full to capacity on a Friday afternoon, windows open as far as they would go, and not going far enough, smelled of cigarette smoke and damp wool, and whatever everyone had eaten for lunch, and the conductor came up the stairs into all of it without complaint, and started working the rows from the back. A leather satchel on one hip, a ticket machine on the other, a rack of rolled tickets in different colors for different fare stages, clipped to the machine's housing. You had your money ready, because the conductor was already 3 seats ahead, and would reach you in a moment, and the transaction when it came was fast and specific. He named the fare, you gave the money, he wound the handle of the Gibson or the Almex machine, and a small printed ticket emerged. He tore it off and handed it across without looking at you, because he was already calculating what the person behind you was owed in change. The whole exchange took about 8 seconds. The conductor on a British bus was known, depending on where you grew up, as the conductor, the clippy, or simply the man on the bus. The term clippy had come from the ticket clipping that earlier versions of the job required, punching a hole in a pre-printed ticket to mark its stage. Before issuing machines made the punch redundant. Women had filled conductor roles in large numbers during both World Wars, when the male workforce was elsewhere, and the name had stuck to the job regardless of who held it. By the 1970s, the workforce was mixed, and in cities with large communities of Caribbean and South Asian immigrants who had arrived through the 1950s and 1960s, the conductor role was one of the more visible points of entry into stable employment. Transport for London, then operating as London Transport, had actively recruited in Barbados and Trinidad from 1956 onwards, and the conductor's position was where many of those recruits began. The conductor's responsibilities went beyond fare collection. On a busy route, he managed the loading of passengers at stops, deciding when the deck was full and signaling the driver accordingly with the bell cord. 2 rings meant go. 1 ring from the driver meant stop. 1 ring from the conductor after 2 meant hold on, someone needs more time. The bell was the only communication channel between the cab and the deck, and the conductor was expected to read it and respond correctly at every stop across a full shift. He was also expected to manage the kind of disputes that arose when a passenger disputed a fare, or sat in the cab end seats reserved for elderly and infirm passengers, or refused to move upstairs, or lit a cigarette on the lower deck. There was no security button to press, and no camera system to point at. There was the conductor and his judgment, and in most cases, that was enough. The mechanics of the conductor's disappearance were already in motion before the 1970s began. From July 1966, a change in transport regulations permitted double-decker buses in British cities to be operated by the driver alone, who would collect fares and manage boarding without a conductor present. The financial logic was immediate and compelling. Running a bus route with a driver and a conductor cost roughly twice the staffing of running it with a driver alone, and the bus companies, many of them municipally owned and operating under constant pressure from ratepayers and local councils to reduce their deficits, moved toward one-person operation as quickly as their existing fleets would allow. The constraint was the buses themselves. The older half-cab design, with the engine at the front, a platform at the rear, and an open entrance that passengers stepped on and off while the bus was still moving, required a conductor to manage the platform safely. A driver could not supervise a moving open platform from the cab. The solution was a new generation of rear-engined buses, with enclosed entrances controlled by the driver, and through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the manufacturers produced them in volume. Leyland and Daimler both offered rear-engine double-deckers suited to one-person operation, and the government accelerated the transition by making grant funding available for the purchase of new buses configured for driver-only use, while explicitly withholding the same grants from operators who continued to order traditional half-cab vehicles. The last half-cab buses came off the production lines in Britain around 1970. After that, every new bus that entered service made one fewer conductor necessary. The transition happened at different speeds in different cities. Some operators converted quickly, particularly in areas where staff shortages were already a problem. Others retained conductors on busy routes through the mid-1970s, and in a handful of cases into the 1980s, arguing that on high-volume urban services, the time saved by having a dedicated fare collector justified the additional staffing cost. London kept conductors on the Routemaster buses that ran its busiest central routes long after most other cities had abandoned the model entirely, not because the economics favored it, but because the Routemaster, with its open rear platform, was genuinely unsuited to driver-only operation, and the buses themselves refused to wear out. The last regular Routemaster conductor service in London ran in 2005. What left with the conductor was a particular rhythm of public life. The bus had been a social space, with a person responsible for it. Someone whose job included knowing the route, managing the load, and being present, in a way that a driver behind a sealed cab partition simply was not. You handed money to someone handed something back. The transaction acknowledged that you were both on the same vehicle, going to the same part of the city, and that had counted for something, even if neither of you had ever said so. You've just seen how a bell cord and a ticket machine were enough to hold a whole bus together, and how removing one person from the equation changed the feel of the journey entirely. Coming up, there's a job that worked the streets rather than the routes, and the man who did it announced himself so you could hear him coming from 2 streets away. Section 6. The Rag and Bone Man. You heard him before you saw him. The call itself was almost impossible to transcribe into letters on a page, because what came out of his mouth on a cold Tuesday morning was not quite any word in the English language, but a long, vowel-heavy cry that everyone within 3 streets understood immediately. Older accounts render it as any old iron or rag and bone, but what you actually heard was something more compressed and weathered than that. A sound that had been passed from one generation of street traders to the next for so long that it had worn smooth, the way a stone wears smooth in a riverbed. Your mother heard it and went to the cupboard under the stairs, or the pile in the back bedroom, where old clothes and broken things accumulated, because the Rag and Bone Man did not just collect rags and bones. He took almost anything you no longer wanted, and in exchange he left almost anything he happened to be carrying, which might be a goldfish in a bag, a bunch of artificial flowers, a piece of household china, or simply nothing, depending on what you brought and what mood the morning was in. The trade itself was ancient. Henry Mayhew, documenting the street trades of London in 1851, estimated between 800 and 1,000 bone grubbers and rag gatherers working the capital's streets, living in lodging houses, and surviving on whatever margin remained between collection and sale. The rags went to the paper mills, where they were processed into cardboard and lower-grade paper stock. The bones went to the glue factories and the fertilizer trade. Scrap metal went to the foundries. Dead animals, if you had one, and the Rag and Bone Man was willing, could be skinned for their hides. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could afford to be. The man moving through the streets with his cart was the last stage of a recycling chain that ran all the way up to industrial processing. And the chain worked because he was prepared to carry whatever other people had decided to stop keeping. By the time the 1970s arrived, the horse and cart was still in use, particularly outside the cities, though a significant number of rag and bone men had moved to flatbed lorries or converted vans. The horse gave the job a visual quality that the lorry never quite replaced, a slowness that matched the pace of the calling and let residents hear him coming in time to find something worth bringing out. A horse also required no fuel and no vehicle license, and could be kept at low cost in a yard behind a house on the edge of town. For men operating without much capital, the horse was the more practical option, for longer than the economics of it should logically have held. Steptoe and Son, the BBC sitcom that ran from 1962 to 1974, made Albert and Harold Steptoe the most famous rag and bone men in British cultural history. Their Oil Drum Lane yard in Shepherd's Bush, the most recognizable fictional scrap heap in the country, The show's audience understood exactly what the Steptoes were, because the same figure still moved through real streets, in real towns during the same years the program was broadcasting. What the Rag and Bone Man collected had changed by the 1970s. Bones were no longer the point, since the bone processing industries that had once depended on them had largely mechanized or found alternatives. Rags still had value, sold on to the shoddy trade in the West Riding of Yorkshire, which had been turning reclaimed wool fibers back into low-grade cloth since the early 19th century. But the more reliable income by the 1970s was scrap metal, particularly copper and aluminium, whose prices on the commodity markets were volatile enough to make a good week genuinely profitable and a bad one barely worth the round. A man who knew the metal prices and sorted his load accordingly before he sold it onto the scrapyard could work the margin better than one who simply took everything and sold it in bulk. The decline came from two directions at once. The first was the rise of the council refuse collection as a comprehensive service rather than a basic one. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, local authorities increasingly offered bulky waste collections on request, giving residents a mechanism for disposing of large unwanted items that did not depend on a man calling in the street at an unpredictable time. The second was the arrival of the charity shop as a fixture on British high streets, offering a permanent, static alternative to the informal street trade for anyone with clothes or household goods they wanted to move on. Neither of these alternatives paid anything for what you gave them, where the Rag and Bone Man at least offered the goldfish, but they were there every day, and they did not require you to hear the call in time and get to the door before he rounded the corner. By the early 1980s, the trade had contracted into the scrap metal business almost entirely. The calling and the horse and the goldfish in a bag were gone in most places, replaced by men with lorries who would come by appointment to collect a specific thing for a specific purpose, which was efficient but carried none of the texture of the street trade it had replaced. The last practitioners who still worked in anything close to the traditional manner moved into the scrap metal yards and operated from there, buying rather than collecting, waiting for people to come to them. What went with the Rag and Bone Man was the idea that the street itself was an economy, that there was a commerce available at the curb which did not require a shop or a market stall or any fixed address at all, just a cart, a call, and the knowledge of what things were worth. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how a single voice in the street was enough to set a whole neighborhood in motion, and how the trade it sustained was older than anyone calling it could remember. Coming up next, there's a job that happened in the dark, on purpose, and the person doing it carried a torch with a red beam so as not to disturb you while they worked. Section 7. The cinema usherette red was the color they chose for the torch beam, for a specific reason. Red light does not destroy the eye's ability to see in the dark the way white light does, so a narrow red beam could be directed across an entire row of seats to locate a free space without temporarily blinding the person it swept past. The torches themselves were purpose-made, designed to produce a long, tight column of light rather than the broad wash of an ordinary household torch, so that the usherette could reach 20 feet without illuminating the screen or the people between her and it. You followed that red line through the dark. You put your hand up slightly so she could see you had found the seat. She moved the beam away and you sat down, and the film continued as if she had never been there at all. That was the skill of it. Presence without interruption. The usherette was a fixture of British cinemas from the days of the great picture palaces of the 1930s onwards, and the job accumulated a particular social meaning during those years that stayed attached to it long after the circumstances that created it had changed. In the 1930s and 1940s, when the Gaumont and Odeon and ABC chains were filling their grandest buildings with weekly audiences measured in hundreds per show, being an usherette was considered one of the more desirable positions available to a working-class young woman. The uniform gave it a formality and a visibility that most other available work did not. Gold-braided jackets were standard at the larger chains. The head usherette, who managed the floor and assigned positions to the others, had her own rank marked clearly enough that patrons knew to address her for complaints, rather than the junior staff. Research conducted by Eva Balog at the University of Portsmouth into the oral histories of usherettes, who worked in the 1930s and 1940s, found women who described the uniform as giving them a sense of authority and presentation they could not have accessed elsewhere. Some cinemas ran Miss Cinema of Great Britain contests in the 1950s, where the winner was drawn from working usherettes, and a local Portsmouth newspaper reported in 1956 that a 23-year-old Odeon usherette from Cosham had taken the national title. What the usherette actually did, beyond guiding you to your seat, was defined by the interval. British cinema in the 1970s still ran its programs with a formal break partway through, a holdover from the double feature and newsreel era, when a pause gave the projection room time to change reels and the audience time to smoke, use the bathroom, and buy refreshments. During the interval, the house lights came up, and a spotlight fell on the usherette, or on several usherettes at once if the auditorium was large enough to need them, illuminating the ice cream tray strapped around their neck. The tray held individual blocks of vanilla in cardboard sleeves, chalk ices, tubs, with a small flat wooden spoon tucked under the lid, and in many cinemas throughout the 1970s, cigarettes, because smoking was permitted inside the auditorium itself, until the public health legislation of later decades progressively restricted and then banned it. Commission was paid on what you sold. A good interval in a full house on a Saturday evening could add meaningfully to a shift that the base wage did not make generous. The job was considered unskilled by the same classification system that called the Coleman unskilled, which is to say, the classification was measuring something other than what the work actually required. Managing an auditorium of several hundred people in the dark, directing latecomers without disrupting those already seated, handling the interval trade, dealing with patrons who had chosen the seats reserved for elderly and infirm passengers, or who had lit a cigarette on the no-smoking lower level, or who were in some way making the evening difficult for the people around them, required a specific kind of authoritative calm that the uniform helped project and the training did not entirely teach. You either had the confidence for it, or you didn't last the season. Admissions figures were the problem that the usherette could not solve. British cinema attendance had peaked in 1946 at 1.64 billion visits, a figure that now reads like a misprint. Television did the early damage, particularly after ITV launched in 1955, and gave households a second channel to choose from on evenings they might otherwise have gone out. By the 1970s, the slide had become structural rather than cyclical. Funding for British film production was uncertain. The studio system that had kept a reliable supply of domestic features in the schedules was hollowed out, and the audiences that remained were younger and less habitual than the generation that had gone to the pictures every week as a matter of routine. The decade's admissions ran at roughly 120 million a year at the start and fell toward 90 million by the end, against the 1946 figure that makes both numbers look modest. By 1984, admissions had reached an all-time low of 54 million, less than a single visit per person per year across the entire population. The architecture of the cinemas themselves worked against the old model once the multiplex arrived. The first British multiplex opened in Milton Keynes in 1985, offering multiple screens under one roof with staggered start times and a concession stand in the foyer that was open continuously. There was no interval in the multiplex model because there was no structural need for one, and without the interval, the ice cream tray and the commission and the spotlight had nowhere to go. The usherette, who showed you to your seat, was replaced by a numbering system on the ticket and your own ability to find row J. The torch went into a drawer somewhere and was not replaced. What the usherette had provided, beyond the practical function, was the sense that someone was responsible for the room, a person whose job was to make the experience work, to smooth the entry and manage the dark and appear with something cold and sweet in the middle of it all. The multiplex decided that the customer could manage without that. In terms of admissions, it turned out to be correct. Coming up next, there's a job that operated outside your house rather than inside it, and the people who held it drove a very particular kind of vehicle whose purpose the government was happy for you to find frightening, whether or not the technology inside it actually worked. Section 8. The TV Licence Inspector Public Information Films had a specific grammar in 1970s Britain. a particular tone of calm institutional authority that made them more unsettling than any dramatic threat could have been. The one about the television license showed a plain van moving slowly through an ordinary residential street. On the roof, a small cluster of aerials rotated or tracked. The voiceover explained, in the measured register of someone reading from a document they fully expected you to believe, that the van contained equipment capable of detecting whether a television set was in use inside a private home. The address would be noted. A visit would follow. The license fee in 1973 was £12 for a colour set. The fine for operating a television without a license was up to £400. The film ended. Coronation Street came on, or the news, or whatever it was you were actually watching, and something in the back of your mind filed the information away in a drawer. It did not fully close again. The television license had existed since the first day of the BBC's post-war broadcast service, the 1st of June 1946, when a combined radio and television license was introduced at a cost of £2. The logic was simple enough. The BBC was funded by the people who received its signal, and a license fee collected by the General Post Office was the mechanism chosen to make that funding universal and compulsory. The problem that followed from this logic was also simple. There was no technical means of preventing someone without a license from buying a television and watching it anyway. In 1952, the Post Office estimated that between 100,000 and 150,000 sets were operating in Britain without a license, representing a significant and growing loss to the system. The response, unveiled on the 1st of February 1952 at the Earl's Court radio show by the Postmaster General, Earl de la Warr, was the detector van. The first vans were converted Hillman Minx cars, fitted with equipment developed at the GPO's research facility at Dollis Hill in North London. The detection method targeted the electromagnetic signature produced by the horizontal deflection coils inside a cathode ray tube television during normal operation. A CRT set running in your living room emitted a low-frequency magnetic field at around 10 kHz as the electron beam scanned across the screen line by line. The Dollis Hill equipment could detect that field from a distance of approximately 100 feet, which in a residential street was enough to localize the signal to a specific address. By 1953, according to Post Office figures, the technology was achieving a 90% detection rate across tests conducted in residential areas. Whether those conditions reflected real-world street patrols across the full variety of British housing stock was a question the Post Office declined to address publicly, with considerable care. That care was deliberate, and it was the most important thing about the whole operation. The BBC, which took over administration of the licensing system from the Post Office in April 1991, consistently refused to explain in precise technical terms how the vans worked. The vans existed most powerfully not as detection devices, but as the idea of detection devices. And the idea worked on everyone, whether or not a van had ever been within 3 miles of their street. The public information films of the 1970s were not advertisements for a service. They were the communication of a risk, and the risk was credible, precisely because the technology was never fully described. You knew there were vans. You knew they had aerials. You knew someone in an official capacity was driving them through streets like yours, with the specific purpose of finding you out. Whether the van outside your neighbor's house on a Tuesday afternoon was actually one of them was a question you had no reliable way of answering. The practical enforcement behind the scenes relied heavily on a far more straightforward method than electromagnetic detection. Retailers and rental companies were legally required to report television purchases and rentals to the licensing authority, providing names and addresses that could be cross-referenced against the license database. A household that appeared on a retailer's records as having acquired a color set, but which did not appear in the license database, received a letter and then a visit from a human inspector rather than a van. The inspector knocked on the door, asked to see the license, and if no license could be produced, issued a notice requiring one to be obtained, or a prosecution would follow. Most evasion was caught this way, through paperwork and cross-referencing, rather than through antenna arrays rotating on a rooftop. The vans were the visible part of a system whose invisible part did most of the actual work. Enforcement shifted between authorities over the decades. The post office held it until 1972, when the Home Office assumed direct control. When British Telecom separated from the post office in 1981, the licensing database and its enforcement apparatus eventually transferred to the BBC itself, formalised in 1991. The inspectors who knocked on doors in the interim decades worked for a succession of different employers, but performed the same function throughout, verifying that a license existed, checking its validity against the set being used, and initiating proceedings if it did not. What ended the detector van as anything more than a ceremonial threat was the digital television transition. Analog sets had produced the specific electromagnetic emissions that the Dollis Hill equipment had been designed to catch. Digital tuners, processing signals through entirely different means, produced no comparable radiation. The technical basis for the detection method became obsolete as analog transmission was switched off region by region across Britain between 2007 and 2012. The vans continued to appear in licensing advertisements long after the technology inside them had ceased to be functional against the sets most people were actually watching. The inspector who came to your door was simply a person with a clipboard and a database printout. The van on your street was the reason you answered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how a van full of aerials became one of the most effective enforcement tools in British broadcasting history without necessarily having to do very much detecting at all. Coming up, there's a job that existed in almost every town in Britain and disappeared, not because the work stopped being needed, but because a single engineering project made the human being doing it unnecessary. Section 9. The GPO telephone operator. You lifted the receiver and waited. Not for a dial tone, not for the prompt of an automated system, but for a voice. A real one, belonging to a real person, sitting at a switchboard in a building somewhere in your town, who would come on the line within a few seconds and say, simply, "Number please." 2 words. A question that was also a readiness. You gave the number you wanted, and the operator repeated it back to confirm it, then asked you to hold, and then the connection was made by hand, a physical plug pressed into a socket on a board of hundreds of sockets, routing your call through the exchange to wherever it needed to go. If it was a local call, the whole process took less than half a minute. If it was a trunk call, a long-distance connection to another exchange in another town, you might be asked to give your own number and wait for a callback when the line became available, because the trunk circuits were finite and busy ones had queues, and the operator managed those queues the same way she managed everything else, by knowing the board and knowing the traffic and working through it in order. The telephone exchange had been a female workplace almost from the beginning. The first telephone exchanges in Britain opened in the late 1870s, following the Bell patents, and the early operators were young men, the same messenger boys who had been running telegrams around the city. Within a few years, the men had been largely replaced by women, not for reasons of sentiment, but for reasons of voice and temperament, and, frankly, cost. The post office official Frank Scudamore had already made the argument in the 1870s when he brought women into the telegraph service, writing in official correspondence that the wages sufficient to attract women of a superior class would not attract men of any comparable quality. Women would be more accurate, more patient, more consistently courteous under pressure, and less expensive. The logic held and was applied to the telephone exchange with the same institutional confidence. By the early 20th century, the telephone operator in Britain was so thoroughly understood as a female profession that the handful of men who held the role were the ones who needed explaining. The switchboard she worked was a physical object of considerable complexity. A vertical panel of numbered jacks corresponding to subscriber lines in the local area, with horizontal rows of plugs on cords that she used to make connections. When a subscriber lifted their receiver, a light illuminated on the board above the corresponding jack. She plugged into it, spoke, took the number, then located the destination jack and completed the connection with a second plug on the same cord. 2 lights confirmed the call was running. When the subscriber hung up, the lights went out and she removed the plugs and moved to the next call. On a busy board, in a busy exchange in the middle of the morning, this sequence ran across dozens of simultaneous calls. the operator tracking each connection by its position and its light, completing and clearing and reconnecting in a rhythm that looked from the outside like the performance of a complex instrument. The work was fast, repetitive, and required a sustained accuracy that the formal classification of clerical did not adequately describe. In smaller towns and rural exchanges, the operator's knowledge went beyond the board. She knew the subscribers by their voices as well as their numbers. She knew which numbers belonged to the doctor and the chemist and the police station and the fire brigade. In emergencies, she could connect a distressed caller directly without waiting for a number to be given, because she already knew who they needed. Accounts from rural exchanges in the mid-20th century describe operators who recognized family members calling in, who knew when a subscriber had been ill because their line had gone quiet for a week, and who understood the social geography of their community at a level of detail that no directory or database could replicate. The exchange was a piece of infrastructure that happened to run on human memory. Subscriber trunk dialing began on the 5th of December 1958, when Queen Elizabeth II placed a ceremonial call from Bristol to Edinburgh without operator assistance, demonstrating publicly that long-distance calls could now be direct dialed by the subscriber using a new area code system. The STD rollout spread outward from the major cities through the 1960s, converting exchanges region by region to automatic switching. Rural areas were slower to convert, partly because the older electromechanical equipment in smaller exchanges required more substantial infrastructure investment to upgrade. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, operators continued working in exchanges where the automatic system had not yet reached, managing trunk circuits that the new national network had not yet absorbed. The last fully manual exchange in Britain closed in the 1970s, ending a continuous thread of human-operated telephone connection that had run since the first exchange opened nearly a century before. The operators who remained after the trunk network automated were retained in what the GPO called auto-manual centers, handling the residual calls that the direct dial system could not yet complete: international connections, operator-assisted services, directory inquiries. These were the last formal expressions of the original job, stripped of the board and the plugs, and reduced to a headset and a database. The voice was still there, but the physical knowledge, the understanding of the board that a good operator carried in her hands as much as her head, had nowhere left to go. What you lost when the dial tone replaced the voice was a very specific kind of human presence at the moment of connection. The operator was a third party to every call she made, an unseen person whose competence was the reason the line opened. She heard nothing of what followed and knew none of what was said. Her part was simply to make the thing happen, and for nearly 100 years in Britain, that was enough. There's a job that filled entire floors of office buildings with the sound of one particular machine, and the women who ran those machines were the reason correspondence got sent, contracts got typed, and the whole apparatus of British business kept moving, right up until a single piece of technology made the room they worked in unnecessary overnight. Section 10, the typing pool. Typist sound was the first thing visitors noticed before they had properly entered the room. A good-sized typing pool on a weekday morning in 1970s Britain produced a noise that had no real equivalent anywhere else in the working world. A dense, continuous mechanical clatter that was rhythmic without being regular, built from dozens of individual keystrokes, overlapping and separating, and overlapping again, punctuated by the sharp ping of a carriage return bell, and then the heavier thunk of the return mechanism itself, resetting the line. If you were coming from the carpeted quiet of the management floor above, the sound hit you at the door like a change in weather. The room ran on it. The room was, in one very practical sense, made of it. The typing pool was a piece of industrial logic applied to office work. Correspondence, contracts, reports, memoranda, minutes from meetings, internal communications of every description, all needed to be produced in clean, accurate typescript before they could be sent, or filed, or acted upon. Rather than employ a secretary for every manager and trust the resulting output to be consistent in quality and speed, larger organizations collected their typing requirements in a single room, staffed by women, trained specifically and exclusively to produce typed documents at volume. The work was assessed by measurable outputs, words per minute, error rates, turnaround time. A typist who could hold 90 words per minute with a low correction rate was worth more to the pool than one who could do 60, and the pool supervisor, who managed the floor and allocated work and tracked productivity, ran her room with an efficiency that the factory floor one building over would have recognized immediately as its own. The machine that defined the pool in the 1970s was the IBM Selectric, introduced in 1961 and so thoroughly dominant by the middle of the decade that its operating sound had become the sound the job made. Instead of the conventional basket of individual type bars that swung up to strike the ribbon, the Selectric used a single chrome-plated element roughly the size and shape of a golf ball, which rotated and tilted to the correct position before striking the page. The mechanism selected each character through an internal binary coding system, running a set of mechanical linkages called Whiffletree connections, which sounds elaborate for a typewriter, and was. The result was a machine that produced clean, consistent output at speed, allowed fonts to be changed by swapping the element, and eliminated the jamming of type bars that had been the central frustration of conventional typing since the 1870s. By 1978, IBM held 94% of the electric typewriter market on the strength of the Selectric alone. Every pool of any size ran on them, and the specific whir of the golf ball elements spinning to position became as much a part of the working day as the tea trolley. Correction was its own culture. Tipp-Ex, the white correction fluid in the small bottle with the brush applicator, was a fixture on every desk, and using it was a skilled act in itself. Applied too thickly, it raised a ridge the typewriter platen would catch on. Applied too thinly, it showed through. The best typists used it sparingly and only when the error could not be corrected by other means, because every Tipp-Ex mark was a visible record of a mistake, and the pool supervisor could see your error rate in the documents that came back from the offices upstairs. The professional standard was to produce a clean page. A page with corrections on it was a page that had not met the standard, regardless of how neat the corrections were. The social arrangement around the pool was as structured as the work itself. Managers wrote their correspondence longhand on yellow legal pads, or dictated into dictaphone machines that recorded their voices on a small magnetic belt, and the document came down to the pool for transcription. The manager did not type his own letters. To type your own letter in a large British organization in 1975 was to perform work that belonged to a lower grade, and the grade system in British offices was specific enough that performing work below your grade carried an implied comment on your status that most managers preferred to avoid. The pool existed partly to produce documents and partly to maintain a hierarchy that the documents embodied. When the hierarchy shifted, the pool went with it. IBM's first serious word processor for business use, the OS/6 system, launched in January 1977 at a price that made it a capital investment rather than a desk purchase. The early machines were expensive enough that they enhanced the pool rather than replacing it, giving senior typists a tool that allowed revision and correction without retyping entire documents. The transformation came later, when personal computers running word processing software put a keyboard on every manager's desk and made the act of typing your own correspondence not a demotion, but simply the way work got done. IBM's own researchers found in the early 1980s that male executives were resistant to the personal computer, partly because of its association with secretarial work, and that it was the arrival of spreadsheet software, a tool with no secretarial connotation, that made the PC acceptable as a management instrument. Once the manager was typing his own spreadsheets, the distance between typing spreadsheets and typing letters collapsed quickly. The pool did not close on a single day. It contracted, desk by desk, as individual managers acquired terminals and began producing their own drafts. The supervisor's role diminished as the workload diminished. The room that had run on that layered mechanical clatter went quiet gradually, and then stayed quiet, and then was converted into something else. Nobody sent a memo to mark the occasion. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how an entire floor of trained women and their machines could be made unnecessary by putting a keyboard on the desk of the person who used to hand them the work. Coming up, there's a job that required a 7-year apprenticeship, a union card you could not work without, and a machine the size of a wardrobe that turned molten lead into the words you read every morning over breakfast. Section 11, the hot metal compositor heat, was the first thing the room gave you, and it was not the heat of bodies or sunlight through windows, but something more specific and industrial, a warmth that carried a faint metallic edge you could taste at the back of the throat if you stood in it long enough. Molten-type metal runs at around 300 degrees Celsius, and a composing room with 20 or more linotype machines, all running simultaneously, was a room with 20 or more vats of that metal sitting open at the top of each machine, liquefied and ready, all day, every working day. Operators handled the cast slugs of type with bare hands because the slugs cooled fast enough to be touchable within seconds of casting, though the ambient temperature of the room never quite let you forget what they had been a moment before. The smell of it, lead and antimony, and the particular dry warmth of hot metal in an enclosed space was what stayed with people who worked in composing rooms long after they had left the trade. Decades later, former compositors described catching that same metallic edge on a warm day near certain industrial sites and being taken immediately back. The linotype machine was invented by Ottmar Mergenthaler, a German-born watchmaker working in Baltimore, and the first working model was demonstrated to the New York Tribune in 1886. The name came directly from what it did. It cast a complete line of type as a single piece, a linotype, rather than requiring each individual letter to be set by hand, as had been the practice since Gutenberg. The machine took a 90-character keyboard at the front, a magazine of brass letter molds called matrices, arranged in channels at the top, and a pot of molten-type metal at the core. The operator typed the line of text. The machine assembled the corresponding matrices in sequence, justified the line to the correct width by expanding metal spacing bands between words, then pressed the assembled line against the metal pot and cast the whole thing at once as a solid lead slug. The slug dropped into a tray. The matrices rose on a distribution bar and were sorted automatically back into their correct channels for reuse. The operator was already typing the next line. Getting to sit at one of those keyboards took years. In Fleet Street and across British regional newspapers in the 1970s, the composing room was the territory of the National Graphical Association, whose closed shop meant that no one worked a press or a composing room without a union card, and no one got a union card without serving an apprenticeship of between 5 and 7 years. The apprenticeship began when you left school, and it ran alongside the working day, learning first the manual hand setting of individual type from shallow lettered cases arranged in a specific layout around the compositor's frame, then the operation of the machine itself, then the broader craft of page assembly. What the NGA also controlled, through long-established custom rather than any written rule, was who the apprentices were. Sons of members had priority. In practice, the trade passed from father to son across enough generations that the composing rooms of major British newspapers in the 1970s contained men whose grandfathers had set type in the same buildings by the same methods. The closed shop was also a family. Page assembly happened on the stone, which was not stone, but a flat metal table, specifically a surface of machined steel, where the compositor assembled the cast slugs into the columns and blocks that would become a newspaper page, locking them into a steel frame called a forme. Stone subs, sub-editors who worked at the stone rather than at a desk upstairs, moved between the forms with galley proofs and page plans, making last-minute decisions about headlines and column widths in collaboration with the compositor, whose knowledge of what the metal would and would not do was the practical constraint within which every editorial decision operated. The journalist wrote the story upstairs. The compositor made it physical. The stone sub stood between them and managed the translation. A compositor from the Yorkshire Evening Press, who began his apprenticeship in the mid-1970s, recalled a composing room with more than 20 machines running, some of them then state-of-the-art Intertype Monarchs, whose keyboards had been blanked off to run from punched tape produced in an adjacent room, producing the teletypeset copy that represented the first hesitant reach of the industry toward automation. The tape machines cast the slugs without an operator at the keyboard, which was efficient for straight text and useless for anything that required the compositor's judgment about spacing, correction, or the particular demands of a page that was not cooperating with its measurements. The operator remained necessary because the machine, however sophisticated, could not read the forme. What ended it was not a single technology, but a sequence of them. Phototypesetting, which composed text photographically onto film rather than casting it in metal, had been available since the 1960s and was adopted steadily through the 1970s by publishers who could negotiate its introduction past the NGA's resistance. The resistance was substantial because the operators of phototypesetting equipment did not need the 7-year apprenticeship, did not need the card, and could be paid on a scale that made the compositor's rate look like a premium the industry had simply decided it no longer wished to pay. The resolution came on the 24th of January 1986, when Rupert Murdoch moved production of The Times, The Sunday Times, The Sun, and The News of the World to a new plant in Wapping, East London, equipped entirely for computer-based composition, with journalists inputting their own copy directly. Approximately 6,000 production workers came out on strike and were immediately dismissed. 670 new operators at Wapping produced what 6,800 had produced on Fleet Street. The strike lasted 54 weeks and ended in defeat. Within 2 years, every national British newspaper had abandoned Fleet Street entirely. The composing room, with its heat and its smell, and its particular tinkling sound of matrices dropping into the assembly channel, was gone inside a decade. The apprenticeship, that had taken 7 years to complete, was never offered again. Up next, there's a job that required no union card and no apprenticeship at all. Just a leather bag, a clipboard, and the kind of persistence that meant going out in the rain on a Wednesday evening when you had already worked a full day at something else entirely. Section 12. The Tallyman Wednesday evening meant a knock you were expecting. Not the telegram boy's knock, which arrived without warning and carried its own weight of anxiety, and not the pools collector, who came on Thursday. The tallyman came midweek, and you knew he was coming because he had been coming every Wednesday for as long as you could clearly remember, and the transaction when he arrived was not quick, but it was familiar. He stood at the door with a ledger book, found your page, noted the payment you handed over, wrote the amount in his column, and handed the book back for you to initial against the entry. The goods he had sold you 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 2 years ago, were already in the house. The carpet was under your feet. The 3-piece suite had your shape worn into it. The payment you were making on this particular Wednesday evening was not the last one, and it was not clear when the last one would be, but it would come eventually if you kept up the weekly installments. And in the meantime, the arrangement continued, and the tallyman came back. The word tallyman described 2 related functions that were usually performed by the same person. He was the salesman who knocked on your door originally and persuaded you to take the goods, and he was the collector who returned every week thereafter to gather the payment. The product he sold was not, in any precise sense, a sofa or a set of curtains. The product was credit, specifically the access to goods that a household with an irregular income and no standing with a bank or a conventional hire purchase company could not otherwise obtain. The tallyman's customers were not, as a rule, the chronically poor in the absolute sense. They were the working poor, people in employment whose income was uncertain enough, seasonal enough, or simply low enough that the formal credit market had no mechanism for reaching them. The tallyman had a mechanism. He went to their door and he came back every week, and he adjusted the arrangement when the income dipped and noted it in his book, and came back the following Wednesday. Nobody sent a letter threatening consequences. The relationship was managed in person, on a doorstep, at a human scale. Provident Financial traced this model back to 1880, when a Bradford Methodist named Joshua Wadilove established the Provident Clothing Club with the specific intention of providing credit to working people locked out of conventional finance. Wadilove's agents initially distributed vouchers exchangeable at particular partnered retailers rather than cash, which gave Provident control over what the credit was spent on and reassured the retailers that the vouchers would be honored. The agent network built outward from Bradford through the following decades, until by the mid-20th century, Provident had become the largest home-collected credit business in Britain, with an agent network that at its peak exceeded 7,000 self-employed collectors, serving approximately 2.4 million customers. Each agent ran their own patch the way the pools collector ran his round, on commission, on personal relationship, on the understanding that showing up reliably was the job, and that the job was what the relationship produced. What the tallyman sold varied considerably. The History Forum accounts of door-to-door trade in the industrial north of England describe men who carried nothing to the door themselves, but whose companies would supply and deliver absolutely anything a household needed, from furniture to appliances, to carpets to crockery to clothing, assessed against what the family could demonstrably afford to pay back per week. The assessment was the tallyman's judgment, made on the doorstep on the basis of what he could see and what the household had previously managed to sustain. There was no credit check in any formal sense, no application, no reference. There was a conversation, and a decision, and a delivery, and then there was Wednesday. The Never Never, as this form of hire purchase was universally known, carried an implied acknowledgement in its name that the total price being paid was never quite going to resolve itself into something you could point to and call finished. The payments were open-ended in the sense that the interest and the charges embedded in the weekly rate meant that the total cost of the goods considerably exceeded their retail price, and the length of the arrangement extended that difference further the longer it ran. A Victorian journalist writing in the Railway Review in 1880 described the tallyman as operating with an insidious patience, insinuating himself into households through regular and friendly visits, extending credit that trapped as much as it enabled. That critique was 100 years old when the 1970s arrived, and it had not become less accurate. The Consumer Credit Act of 1974 brought the first comprehensive regulation to the market in which the tallyman operated, requiring proper disclosure of interest rates and total costs, standardizing the terms under which credit could be offered and withdrawn, and establishing formal rights for borrowers that the previous informal arrangements had not recognized. The Act did not end the trade, but it changed its character, imposing the paperwork and the disclosure requirements that the ledger and doorstep model had previously operated without. What ended the tallyman in his traditional form was not regulation alone, but the gradual extension of formal consumer credit into households that had previously been excluded from it. Credit cards arrived in British wallets through the 1970s. Store credit became standard at the major retailers through the 1980s. The specific niche the tallyman had occupied, the gap between what a bank would offer and what a working family actually needed, narrowed steadily as mainstream finance moved into it. By the time Provident finally closed its home-collected credit operation in May 2021, the model that had sustained it for 140 years had already been contracting for 2 decades. The ledger book and the Wednesday knock and the initial beside the figure in the column were gone long before that. They had simply stopped being the only way the transaction could happen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how an entire financial system ran on weekly doorstep visits, and a man with a ledger who showed up in all weathers because the relationship was the product. Coming up next, there's a job that was one of the most intimate forms of access any stranger ever had to your home, and the person doing it was trusted with a key. Section 13. The Council Rent Collector. Friday morning was when he came, and the envelope was ready on the hall table. Not a sealed envelope, just a folded one, or sometimes simply the coins and notes sitting loose in a saucer because your mother knew exactly what was owed and had counted it out the night before. The rent collector worked a patch the way the poolsman worked his round, and the tallyman worked his streets, covering the same addresses in the same order each week, collecting from each household in turn, marking the payment in his book, and issuing a receipt from his pad. The difference was what the money was for. This was not a gambling stake or an installment on a carpet. This was rent, owed to the council, on a house the council owned, and a significant portion of the entire country was making this same transaction on the same morning to the same kind of man in the same way. By the late 1970s, council housing accounted for around 30% of all homes in Britain. In 1979, across England, Scotland, and Wales combined, Approximately 42% of the population lived in council-owned accommodation. Those were not marginal numbers. They described a housing system in which the local authority was the landlord for nearly half the country, and collecting the rent that system depended on was a job that had to be done by someone, at scale, reliably, every week without interruption. The rent collector was that someone, multiplied across every local authority in every town and city, working patches that could cover several hundred households each. The practical intimacy of the job was unlike almost anything else in public administration. The rent collector came to your door. He knew which households paid promptly and which ones needed a second call. He knew which tenants had been in the property for 20 years and which had arrived recently and were still finding their feet. He knew, because the evidence was in front of him each week, when a household's circumstances had changed, when someone had lost a job, when an elderly tenant had stopped answering the door in a way that was different from simply being out. He was not a social worker and was not employed as one, but the regularity of his visits and the access they gave him to the condition of individual households made him a kind of informal first responder to domestic difficulty. Accounts from former council housing departments describe rent collectors who flagged maintenance problems they had noticed on their rounds, who reported concerns about elderly tenants who had not collected their milk, who noted when a property appeared to be occupied by more people than the tenancy specified. The rent was the official purpose of the visit. What it enabled went considerably further. Some collectors carried keys to properties where the tenant worked days and had arranged for rent to be left accessible. Others had standing arrangements where the back door was left on the latch on Friday mornings. The level of trust involved was the same as the coalman who went through the front door to the coal hole, or the milkman who knew which step the note went under. It was trust, built across years of weekly contact rather than any formal verification, and it operated in both directions. The collector knew not to touch anything. The tenant knew the collector would be there and that the receipt would be accurate. The system ran on relationship, and it ran smoothly for decades because the relationship was maintained by showing up. The right to buy legislation, introduced by Margaret Thatcher's government in the Housing Act of 1980, began changing the arithmetic of the patch immediately. Council tenants who had lived in their homes for at least 3 years became entitled to purchase them at a discount that started at 33% and rose with the length of tenancy. The properties that sold first were, predictably, the most desirable ones, the houses rather than the flats, the quieter streets rather than the larger estates. As those properties left the council stock, they left the collector's book with them, and the replacement properties that a council might have built with the sale proceeds were barred from being funded that way by the same legislation. The patch shrank and did not grow back. Computerization did the rest. Local authority housing departments through the 1980s and into the 1990s moved their rent accounts onto systems that allowed payment by standing order and then direct debit, which meant the transaction that had required a weekly visit and a receipt could now be completed without either party being present at all. The collector's book became a database. The Friday envelope became a bank transfer. The receipt became a statement line. What went with the rent collector was the last piece of a network of weekly doorstep visits that had made the street itself a kind of administered place, somewhere that public services arrived in person on a regular schedule, and where someone employed by an institution knew your face and your name, and whether this Friday was different from last Friday. Up next, there's a job held by someone who worked before anyone else was awake, who carried nothing but a long stick and a purpose, and whose entire function was to make sure Britain got out of bed in time for the shift. Section 14, the knocker-upper. Before 4 in the morning, the street was completely dark and completely silent, and then there was a sound against the glass above your head that was not quite a knock and not quite a tap, but something in between, rhythmic and precise. 2 or 3 contacts, and then nothing. Then the sound of footsteps moving on to the next house along. If it was meant for someone else in the street, you might not even surface fully. The sound registered somewhere below waking, and then the silence came back, and you went under again. If it was meant for your window, you were up. That was the arrangement. You opened the curtain, showed a light, or raised a hand, so the figure on the pavement below could see you had registered the call, and the figure moved on without waiting. The job was to wake you, not to watch you dress. The knocker-upper carried a long pole, sometimes bamboo for the upper stories, where a heavier stick would not reach cleanly, and walked a round that had been established by contract with the households who paid for the service. The fee was small, pennies per week per household, which meant the round needed to be large enough to add up to a viable weekly income, which in turn meant the knocker-upper was moving through a considerable stretch of street in any given morning, covering the routes with the efficiency of someone who had done them so many times that the sequence was automatic. Mill workers, dock workers, anyone on a shift pattern that started before the town was reliably awake were the clientele. The alarm clock had existed in various forms since the 19th century, but reliable cheap ones were not universally available until well into the 20th, and in the industrial towns of northern England, the knocker-upper was a more dependable solution than a mechanism that needed winding correctly and could stop without warning. The trade was established enough in Britain by the late Victorian period to appear in working-class oral accounts and in photographs, and it had the particular quality of street trades that sustained themselves through direct personal relationship with a fixed local clientele. You knew your knocker-upper. You paid him or her directly. If you were going to miss a morning, you told them in advance, rather than simply not appearing at the window, because their round depended on knowing which addresses needed calling and which did not on any given day. One photograph taken in the East End of London in 1931 by John Topham shows a knocker-upper at work in the pre-dawn, using a pea shooter rather than a pole to deliver a more targeted tap against an upper window without disturbing the house next door. The pea shooter was a precision instrument in this context, which is a sentence that sounds absurd until you consider the alternative. A 6-foot bamboo pole swung against glass at 4 in the morning in a terrace of houses where the windows were 3 feet apart. The classic question about the trade, which people were still asking in the 1970s, in the industrial areas, where a handful of knocker-uppers were still working, was simply this: who woke up the knocker-upper? The answer was usually that they kept different hours themselves, sleeping early in the evening and rising in the small hours on a body clock that had adjusted to the schedule, or that a family member in the house held the first alarm, or in some accounts, that they simply never slept deeply enough to need waking. It was not a satisfying answer, and it was not meant to be. The question was already partly a joke about the circularity of the arrangement, and partly a genuine recognition that the job placed a specific and personal burden on the person doing it that other service trades did not. The milkman started before dawn too, but the milkman was not personally responsible for whether you made your shift. The trade ended not in a single moment, but in a slow thinning out. Cheap, reliable alarm clocks became standard household items through the middle of the century. Battery-powered models in the 1950s removed the dependency on correct winding. The households that had relied on the knocker-upper acquired their own means of waking and cancelled the arrangement, address by address, until the rounds were too small to sustain the income, and the remaining practitioners moved on to other work. A few continued into the early 1970s in the mill towns and dock areas of northern England, working routes that had contracted to a fraction of what they had once covered. By the mid-70s, the trade was effectively finished across the whole country. Nobody had to explain to anyone why it had ended. The clock on the bedside table was the explanation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how an entire profession existed to solve the single daily problem of getting a sleeping person vertical before the shift started, and how one cheap mechanical device made every person doing that job unnecessary. Coming up, there's a job that ran not on a single street or a single building, but underneath entire landscapes. And in 1971, it employed nearly 300,000 people. Section 15. The coal miner darkness underground is not like darkness anywhere else. Darkness in a room is temporary, contextual, ended by a switch or a window. Darkness at the bottom of a working pit, if the lamp went out, was total, in a way that had no equivalent at the surface. A blackness with weight and temperature, and a silence interrupted only by the sounds the rock itself made, as the earth above it shifted its extraordinary mass through the working day. The men who went down in the cage every morning had made a specific accommodation with that darkness, and with everything that went with it, the dust that settled in the lungs over the years, regardless of precaution, the roof that could move without warning, the physical depletion of cutting and hauling coal at the face in a space rarely tall enough to stand upright in. They had made this accommodation, generation after generation in the same communities, because the work was there, and the wage was there, and in the pit villages of Yorkshire, Durham, South Wales, Nottinghamshire, Scotland and Kent, the mine was the economic fact around which everything else organized itself. In 1956, 700,000 men produced 207 million tons of coal across Britain's working collieries. By 1971, that figure had already contracted sharply, 290,000 workers producing 133 million tons at 292 collieries. The workforce had more than halved in 15 years. Productivity per man had risen substantially, which was the point of the mechanization programs that had been running through the pits since nationalization in 1947. The National Coal Board, which had taken the industry into public ownership under Clement Attlee's government, managed a steady rationalization of the least productive pits through the 1950s and 1960s, closing hundreds of smaller collieries and concentrating output in the larger, more mechanically intensive ones. The closures cost communities that had no other economic base, and they generated the political tension that ran through the industry for 30 years. The 1972 strike was the first time British miners had walked out officially since 1926, and it worked. The Heath government, caught between the striking miners and a coal supply that was running out faster than anyone in Whitehall had planned for, declared a state of emergency and negotiated a settlement that gave the miners a wage increase, substantially above what the Coal Board had initially offered. The image from that dispute that stayed in the public memory was the mass picket at the Saltley Coke depot in Birmingham, where thousands of miners and trade unionists blockaded the gates until the depot closed. The miners had demonstrated something about their collective strength that the industry and the government both noted, and neither forgot. What the miner produced underground was a physical thing, coal, which had to be cut from the face with machinery that shook the body over a full shift, loaded onto conveyor systems, brought to the surface in cages, sorted at the pit head, and distributed from the colliery yard. The work was classified as skilled in the sense that each coal seam had its own geology, and each face had its own conditions, and the men who worked a particular seam knew it in a way that could not be transferred directly to another pit or another coal field. The knowledge was local and physical and accumulated over years. It was also a knowledge that was shared across a community in which the pit dominated everything: the working hours, the social calendar, the brass band, the Miners' Welfare Institute, the Working Men's Club, the patterns of illness and injury that ran through the generations of families who had sent men underground in the same landscape for a century. The 1984 to 1985 strike was the one that broke what remained. Arthur Scargill's National Union of Mine Workers walked out in March 1984 in response to proposed pit closures under the Coal Board chairman Ian McGregor, the American-born industrialist, appointed by Margaret Thatcher specifically to restructure an industry the government had decided it could no longer subsidize on its existing terms. The strike lasted 54 weeks, produced scenes of confrontation between pickets and police that ran on news bulletins for a year, and ended in defeat for the union in March 1985, without a negotiated settlement. Pit closures accelerated immediately. By the end of the decade, the industry employed fewer than 100,000 people. The last deep coal mine in Britain, Kellingley Colliery in North Yorkshire, closed in December 2015. What vanished was not only an industry, but a complete way of organizing a community around a single shared purpose. The village existed because the pit existed. When the pit went, the village remained, but the thing that had given it its particular coherence was gone. Next, there's a job that ran above ground rather than below it, in enormous buildings full of fire and noise, and in 1971, it employed 323,000 people across Britain, who have since been reduced to a fraction of that number. Section 16. The steel worker. Molten steel at tapping temperature runs at somewhere between 15 and 1700 degrees Celsius, and when the furnace is opened, the light it gives off is not like any light produced by combustion or electricity. It is white at the core, shading through yellow to orange at the edges, and it illuminates the men working around it with a flat, sourceless brightness that removes all shadow and makes the whole furnace bay look briefly like the interior of something that does not follow ordinary physical rules. The steelworkers who managed this moment had learned to read that light, to judge the temperature and the composition of the heat from what the molten metal looked like before the instruments confirmed it. One former Sheffield worker who spent more than 40 years in the industry described how experienced furnace men could tell the condition of a heat from the color alone, a skill that took years to develop and that no instrument of the period could fully replicate. Computers do the measuring now. In 1971, it was the eyes. The 1971 Census of Employment recorded 323,000 steelworkers in Great Britain, representing 1.5% of everyone in employment in the country. The industry ran across Sheffield and Rotherham, Scunthorpe, Port Talbot in South Wales, Motherwell and the Ravenscraig plant in North Lanarkshire, Consett in County Durham, Corby in Northamptonshire, and dozens of smaller works and rolling mills scattered through the industrial Midlands and the North. Harold Wilson's Labour government had nationalised the largest companies in 1967, bringing approximately 350,000 workers under the British Steel Corporation at a stroke. The logic of nationalisation was that steel was a strategic industry and that its capacity, investment decisions, and employment should be managed in the national interest rather than left to private companies who might close a plant the moment it became unprofitable, regardless of what the closure did to the town around it. Sheffield was the industry's heartland, in a way that went beyond simple geography. The city had been making steel since the medieval period, initially in small cementation furnaces, and later in the crucible process that Benjamin Huntsman had developed at Handsworth in the 1740s, producing a cast steel of exceptional quality that Sheffield cutlers had built an international trade on. By the 20th century, the city's Don Valley contained a concentration of special steels production, high alloy and stainless and tool steels, that was unmatched anywhere in the world. These were not commodity products rolled out by the mile. They were precision materials whose manufacture required metallurgical knowledge accumulated over generations and a workforce that understood what the composition of a particular grade meant for how it had to be handled at every stage of production. The expertise was in the people as much as in the equipment, and it could not be relocated or reconstructed quickly anywhere else. What the steelworker made was heavy, physical, and vast. The products of a working steel plant were not components or components of components. They were structural steel for bridges and buildings, rail for the railway network, plate for ships, rod and bar for construction, coil for the automotive industry. The work that produced them required a physical familiarity with industrial processes that operated at a scale most employment never approached. The tap hole, the ladle, the continuous casting machine, the rolling mill, the coil line. Each stage had its own hazards and its own learned routines, and the men who worked them over careers of 20 and 30 years developed a knowledge of the plant that was inseparable from the physical fact of standing in it every day. John Heaps, who worked in the Sheffield Steelworks for more than 40 years, described being engulfed in flames from a furnace on one occasion and surviving because of the safety clothing, an account that communicates with some precision what the baseline of the working environment required you to absorb as a daily condition of the job. The British Steel Corporation ran at a loss through the 1970s. By the time the losses reached approximately £145 million annually, the strategy of subsidizing output to maintain employment was running into political resistance that the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 converted into policy. Ian McGregor, the same industrialist who would later be sent to the coal board, was appointed to chair British Steel in 1980, with a mandate to make the corporation commercially viable. A 13-week national steel strike began in January of that year, the first national steel strike in Britain since 1926, and it ended without achieving the wage settlement the unions had sought. The restructuring that followed was among the most rapid in British industrial history. Between 1978 and 1981, the workforce fell from 271,000 to 167,000, a loss of more than 100,000 jobs in 3 years. Consett closed in 1980, taking with it a steelworks that had been the economic basis of a County Durham town for over a century. The closure was announced in September, and production ended in weeks. 11,000 jobs in the local economy depended either directly or indirectly on the works. In a town of 20,000 people, with no alternative employer of comparable scale anywhere nearby, what replaced Consett's steelworks was eventually a business park and a cycle route along the old mineral railway. The ground where the furnaces had stood was landscaped, and the slag heaps were grassed over, and the transformation was thorough enough that someone visiting the site a decade later would have found it difficult to reconstruct in their mind the scale of what had previously occupied the same land. Ravenscraig in Motherwell, which had been producing steel since 1954 and at its height employed over 10,000 people, closed in 1992, ending steelmaking in Scotland entirely. The camaraderie that former steelworkers describe was not incidental to the work. It was produced by the work, by the shared management of physical danger and the mutual dependence of men, who each held a piece of knowledge the process required. A furnaceman who did not trust the ladle operator had no margin for that distrust when the tap was open. The trust was structural, built into the job itself, and it produced the kind of workplace solidarity that was not a sentiment but a practical necessity. By 2014, the industry employed 34,500 people across Great Britain, roughly a tenth of the 1971 figure. Today the number is lower still. The blast furnace that lit the furnace bay white is mostly cold now. The men who could read the color of the heat are retired or gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how an industry that employed 1/3 people and lit up entire valleys at night can contract to almost nothing inside a single generation. Coming up, there's a much quieter job, one that happened in your front room rather than a furnace bay, and the man who did it arrived with a bag of components and the ability to bring the television back to life. Section 17, the TV repairman. Somewhere in the middle of a weekday evening, the picture shrank to a bright horizontal line across the center of the screen, or went to rolling vertical lines that no amount of adjustment on the tuning dial would settle, or simply vanished with a high-pitched whine and left you looking at a gray blank rectangle in the corner of the room. You knew the feeling immediately. There was a particular domestic dejection that came with a failed television set in 1970s Britain that had no equivalent in any other appliance breakdown, because the television was not merely a convenience. By the mid-70s, it was the organizing object of the evening, the thing the chairs faced and the schedules bent around, and its absence left a silence in the living room that felt structural rather than merely inconvenient. You rang the number, the repairman came. Whether he came from the rental company or as an independent depended on your arrangement. Television rental was a dominant model in Britain through the 1950s, 1960s, and well into the 1970s, sustained by the unreliability of the sets themselves and the expense of buying one outright. Radio rentals, DER, Rediffusion, Granada, Vision Hire, and Thorn Television Rentals all operated national networks of high street shops and service engineers. Radio rentals alone, at its peak, claimed more than 2 million customers across 500 shops, employing over 6,000 technicians and skilled installers. DER, founded in 1939 as Domestic Electric Rentals, had amassed 397 stores by 1968. The rental company's engineers drove company vans and carried the components specific to the sets they serviced, because the rental model promised the customer that if the set failed, it would be repaired or replaced at no additional cost. The repairman's visit was part of what you were paying the weekly rental charge for. The reason the sets failed so often was the valve. Cathode ray tube televisions of the 1950s and 1960s used vacuum tubes, glass valves the size and rough shape of electric light bulbs, to amplify the electronic signal at each stage of the circuit. A typical television contained dozens of them. Each one had a finite lifespan, and the combination of heat they generated collectively inside the cabinet, the vibration of normal household use, and the simple accumulation of operating hours meant that one or another would fail, with a regularity that the rental companies factored into their business model as a straightforward cost of doing business. The repairman arrived, opened the back of the set, tested the valves with a meter, identified the failed one, replaced it from his bag of spares, and the picture came back. If the fault was more complex, the set went back to the workshop on the van and a replacement set came off it, which is why the man on the History Forum account from the 1970s remembered the rental engineer's standard line of delivery: "Your set needs to go back to the shop, but here is another one for the time being." Color television accelerated the repair trade before it eventually undermined it. Color sets introduced in Britain from 1967 onwards were more complex than their black and white predecessors, contained more components, generated more heat, and failed more frequently in the early years of the technology. Rental charges for a color set in the 1970s ran at roughly double those for black and white, at around 25 shillings a week. The higher charge reflected both the cost of the set and the cost of maintaining it, because the early color receivers were expensive to repair and required engineers who understood the additional circuitry of the color decoding systems. The skill level required went up with the complexity of the sets, and the engineers who developed that skill through the early and mid-70s were valuable to the rental companies in a very specific and practical sense. Solid-state electronics began changing the repair trade from the inside, before most customers had noticed anything had shifted. Transistorized circuits replaced valves through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, producing sets that ran cooler, consumed less power, and failed less frequently. By the late 1970s, the new generation of sets was demonstrably more reliable than what had come before, and the fundamental economic argument for renting rather than buying, that a rented set would be maintained at the rental company's expense, weakened as the maintenance requirement fell. One engineer who worked for radio rentals from 1971 until 1982 recalled watching the customer base shrink steadily from the start of that decade as television sets became more reliable and customers moved from renting to buying. By 1981, he recalled, the industry was losing more customers than it gained. The integrated circuit completed the transition that the transistor had begun. Sets built on microchips in the 1980s were not only more reliable, but increasingly difficult for a generalist engineer to repair, because a failed chip could not be tested with a meter and replaced from a bag of spares. It had to be identified by substitution, ordered from a manufacturer, and fitted with equipment the independent repairman often did not carry. The economics of repair began working against the repairman because the labor and parts cost of fixing an older set increasingly approached the retail price of a new one, and the customer made the obvious calculation. The vans stopped coming. The set you bought from a shop you owned, and when it failed, you bought another. There's a job that existed at every railway station of any size in Britain. A figure in a uniform who carried your luggage without being asked and knew every platform and every connection by memory. Section 18. The British rail porter Steam was still clearing from the platform when he appeared beside you. You had not asked for help and had not needed to, because the porter on a busy British rail station in the early 1970s operated on a different logic from waiting to be summoned. He read the platform the way the bus conductor had read the deck, taking in who had arrived, what they were carrying, where they were likely headed, and moving toward the relevant problem before it had fully become one. If you had come off the overnight from Edinburgh with a trunk and 2 cases and were 65 years old and trying to work out which exit connected to the taxi rank, the porter had already assessed all of that from 30 feet away and was closing the distance with a flat-topped trolley that he pushed with one hand while touching the peak of his cap with the other. The word porter was stitched into the collar of his blue jacket or waistcoat. He had a number badge on the sleeve. By the 1970s, the linen-sleeved waistcoat that porters had worn since the Victorian era was still the standard garment on many stations, unchanged in its essential design through more than a century of railway operation. The porter's formal duties covered luggage handling, passenger assistance, general platform maintenance, and at smaller stations where staffing was thin, a range of additional functions that could extend to ticket collection at the barrier and parcels handling in the goods office. At the most junior end of the grade structure, the porter was the entry point to railway employment, the position from which a young man might progress over time through signalman, guard, and station master if he showed the aptitude and accumulated the seniority. The railway had been running this internal progression since the Victorian private companies first established it, and British Railways, which nationalised the network from the Big Four companies on the 1st of January 1948, inherited the grade structure along with the track and the rolling stock and the debt. What the Beeching Report of 1963 did to the network established the conditions under which the porter's role would later contract. Richard Beeching, appointed by Transport Minister Ernest Marples to find a way of returning the nationalised railway to profitability, published his first report in March 1963, identifying 2,363 stations and 5,000 miles of route for closure. The closures peaked through the mid-1960s and continued into the early 1970s, eventually eliminating around a third of all stations on the network and the same proportion of route mileage. Each closed station was a platform on which no porter was any longer required, and the closures happened at sufficient scale and speed that they constituted a structural reduction in the total demand for the role across the country before any deliberate policy decision about the porter's future had been made. The deliberate policy came next. British Rail through the 1970s pressed steadily toward reducing staffing costs on the stations that remained open, and the porter represented a category of expenditure that the new financial culture of the organisation was willing to question. Self-service was the frame through which the change was communicated to passengers. The argument was that modern travellers were mobile and independent and did not require assistance to find their platform or manage their luggage, and that the resources consumed by maintaining a porter presence on every staffed station could be deployed more efficiently elsewhere. Trolleys were provided at the larger stations so that passengers could handle their own cases without asking anyone. Signs were improved. The physical environment of the station was redesigned around the assumption that the passenger would navigate it alone. The porter went into decline across British rail stations through the 1970s, formally phased out as a standard staffing grade as older porters retired and their positions were not filled. At the largest and busiest interchange stations, a residual presence continued longer because the volume of passengers and the complexity of the connections generated enough genuine need that removing assistance entirely created visible operational problems. At the majority of stations, the role simply stopped being part of the staffing establishment. What the porter had provided was a specific human presence on the platform that went beyond luggage. He knew the station, which meant he knew when the connection was tight and whether the lift was working, and which taxi firm was reliable, and where the waiting room was that actually had the heating on in January. That knowledge lived in the person and transferred to the passenger in a 2-minute conversation that no improved sign system could fully replace. By the mid-1970s, the conversation was not happening because the person was no longer there to have it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how an entire category of human knowledge, the deep familiarity with a specific place and its routines, can be declared unnecessary and removed from the platform without ceremony. Coming up, there's a job that required mastering an entirely different language, one invented specifically for speed, and the women who held it were the reason British offices communicated at all. Section 19. The shorthand secretary Pitman's system is built on sound rather than spelling. Isaac Pitman published it in 1837 under the title Stenographic Soundhand, and the principle at its center was that English as spoken and English as written were two different things, and that a notation system designed to capture what the mouth produced rather than what the hand was trained to spell could achieve speeds that conventional writing could never approach. Thin strokes represented voiceless consonants, the p and t and f sounds. Thicker strokes represented their voiced equivalents, b and d and v. Vowels were indicated by small dots and dashes positioned around the consonant strokes, or omitted entirely when the experienced reader could infer them from context and speed demanded it. The system looked, to anyone who had not learned it, like a page of careful but incomprehensible marks. To a trained secretary reading back from her notebook at the typewriter, it was as legible as any printed text, carrying inside its curves and angles the precise words that the manager had spoken into the air of his office 20 minutes before. By the time the 1970s arrived, Pitman's shorthand had been the dominant secretarial notation system in Britain for a century. The Pitman's Metropolitan School in Southampton Row had accommodated 1,500 students at a time at its Victorian peak, most reaching speeds of 130 words per minute, and the company's examining boards had certificated hundreds of thousands of secretaries across the decades since. Secretarial colleges across Britain through the 1970s taught Pitman's new era, the version revised most recently in 1968, alongside typing speed and office practice, as the core qualification for a career in office work. A secretary who could take dictation reliably at 100 words per minute and transcribe it accurately was a measurably skilled person with a formal certificate to prove it. The Royal Society of Arts ran its own examinations in the system. Employers specified shorthand speeds in their job advertisements the way they specified typing speeds, because both were outputs that could be tested and compared objectively. The physical rhythm of the job had a specific structure. The manager spoke. The secretary sat at a slight angle to his desk, notebook on her knee, pen moving across the page in a continuous series of strokes and curves that bore no visual resemblance to the words being produced. She was not writing letters. She was transcribing sound into a notation that her hands had practiced until the connection between hearing a syllable and producing the corresponding stroke was as automatic as breathing. A trained shorthand secretary did not think about the symbols any more than a proficient typist thought about which key was under which finger. The thinking happened before the skill was acquired. After that, it was reflex, running below consciousness, while the conscious part of the mind tracked the meaning of what was being said to ensure accuracy of transcription. One secretary who took her first job in 1958 and used shorthand throughout a career that ran to retirement recalled reaching speeds of 110 words per minute at her peak, achieved through evening classes taken after her working day had already finished. She described being told when she learned the skill that she probably would not use it her whole working life, and using it until her last day of employment regardless. By the mid to late 1970s, she noted, technology had begun changing around her, though the changes were not yet decisive. The dictaphone, which recorded the manager's voice on a small magnetic belt for transcription later, had already displaced some live shorthand dictation in offices that had adopted it, removing the need for the secretary to be present during the speaking and allowing the transcription to happen asynchronously. But the dictaphone still required a trained typist who could work from audio, and the shorthand secretary who could do both remained the more versatile and therefore more valuable option. What the personal computer completed that the dictaphone had begun was the decoupling of composition from transcription. Once the manager was typing his own correspondence, the chain that ran from spoken word through shorthand notation, through typed transcript, was simply not in operation, because the link between speaking and writing had been cut and replaced by a direct connection between thinking and keyboard. There was no dictation because there was no one to take it. There was no transcription because there was no notation to transcribe. The notebook and its particular marks, which had represented a skilled person's value to an organization as clearly as any professional qualification, had nowhere left to go. Pitman's shorthand still exists. Journalists learn a simplified speed writing derivative. Court reporters still use stenographic notation. The full Pitman system, with its thick and thin strokes and its omitted vowels and its century of certified speeds, is practiced now by a handful of dedicated specialists and remembered by a generation of women for whom it was simply the language of the working day. Next, there's a job that put one person in charge of an entire building's warmth, a role that existed wherever there was a boiler large enough to require someone to understand it, and that required a different kind of expertise from anything we have seen so far in this list. Section 20. The boilerman cold was what you noticed first, going down. The corridor above ground level in a school or a hospital or a factory in midwinter carried its own chill, regardless of how well the building was heated above it, because the basement stairs were always a degree or two behind the floors people actually worked and studied on. and the boiler room door at the bottom was the one point in the whole building where that logic reversed itself completely. Pushing through it from the cold corridor felt like stepping into a different climate, a dense, radiating warmth that was not the gentle heat of a well-insulated room, but the direct heat of fire, coming from the furnace mouth a few feet away. The boilerman worked in that warmth all day. He had stopped noticing it years ago. The institutional boilerman was a specific figure in 1970s Britain, distinct from the ship's stoker of the merchant navy, and distinct from the railway fireman who fed the locomotive's firebox during the steam era. His domain was the stationary boiler, the large coal or coke-fired heating plant installed in the basement of schools, hospitals, factories, council blocks of flats, and any other substantial building whose heating and hot water requirements exceeded what a domestic-scale system could provide. The boiler itself was a Lancashire boiler in many older installations, a horizontal cylindrical pressure vessel with two internal flue channels through which the fire burned, capable of generating the steam pressure that drove heating circuits through the building above. Managing it was not a matter of lighting it and walking away. It required consistent attention through the working day, monitoring the pressure gauges, feeding coal at a rate that maintained the correct temperature without running the fire too hot or letting it drop, clearing the ash pit, and timing the banking of the fire in the evening so the building would hold enough residual heat through the night to give the next morning's start a reasonable foundation. The start of the working day for a boilerman in a school meant arriving before the first teacher. The fire had to be drawing properly and the heating circuits charged with hot water before the building filled with pupils at 9 o'clock, which meant the boiler room was occupied from 6 in the morning or earlier on cold days. The timing was the knowledge. Anyone could be taught to shovel coal into a furnace mouth. The skill was in reading the gauges and the color of the fire and the draft through the flues to know how much coal to add and when, and in understanding the particular character of your own boiler, which in any installation of age had its own habits and tolerances that no manual had written down, because they had been accumulated by the men who had worked the plant before you and passed across in conversation rather than documentation. In hospitals, the boiler room operated continuously. Steam was required not only for heating, but for sterilization of surgical instruments and equipment, which meant the plant could not be allowed to cool overnight. A hospital boilerman might work shifts in a team, each man covering a portion of the 24-hour cycle, because the consequence of a pressure failure in a hospital setting was not merely a cold building, but the interruption of medical processes. The boiler room in that context was closer to an engineering post than a caretaking function, and the men who held it in the larger NHS hospitals of the 1970s had formal boiler certification and worked within safety regimes that treated a pressure vessel of several tons of water and steam with the seriousness that object deserved. The North Sea gas conversion program that had run between 1967 and 1977, switching the entire country's gas supply from town gas to natural gas, extended its effect into institutional buildings as the program matured. Oil-fired boilers, which required no manual stoking and could be regulated thermostatically, had already displaced coal in some institutions through the 1960s as their economics improved. Gas-fired boilers offered the same automation with lower fuel costs in the converted areas, and through the 1970s, local authorities and hospital boards worked through their building stock converting plant from coal to gas or oil, each conversion eliminating the need for a human being to tend the fire. The pressure gauges remained. The monitoring requirement remained in a formal sense, but a gas-fired boiler with automatic controls and a thermostat did not need someone to shovel anything into it at 6 in the morning, and the role of boilerman contracted as the fuel type changed. By the early 1980s, the coal-fired institutional boiler was a rarity in most urban areas. The boiler room itself remained, and in many schools the caretaker retained a notional responsibility for the plant. But the specific, skilled, full-time work of managing a live coal fire beneath a large building, timing the dampers and reading the pressure and arriving before the cold set in, was finished. The warmth came on automatically now, and no one had to produce it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You've just seen how a building's entire warmth once depended on one person arriving before everyone else and understanding a fire well enough to keep it honest. Coming up last, there's a job that sat between you and the switch you were about to make, in a room on the high street where you could walk in owing money and walk out having spent more, and leave feeling like you had done something sensible. Section 21. The Gasboard Showroom Salesperson. Walking into the Gasboard showroom was walking into a room that had been organized specifically around your indecision. Not in any aggressive sense. The Gasboard did not employ high-pressure salespeople in the manner of the tallyman or the door-to-door vacuum cleaner representative. The showroom operated on a different logic, the logic of the display, of the working appliance demonstrated in conditions that approximated your kitchen, of the patient explanation from someone in a uniform that was smart but not intimidating, who could tell you what a new gas cooker would cost to run per week, and what it would cost to install, and what it would do to your quarterly bill, compared with what you were spending on electricity or coal now. The arithmetic usually resolved in a particular direction, and the salesperson was there to walk you through it, at whatever pace you needed. The Gasboard showrooms were a high street fixture in every British town of any size through the 1970s. The industry had been nationalised in 1949, sweeping more than 1,000 separate private and municipal gas companies into 12 regional area gas boards. The North Thames Gas Board alone operated 87 showrooms across its territory at the start of the 1970s, staffed by around 25,000 employees in total across its operations. In 1973, the Gas Act merged the area boards into a single British gas corporation, unifying the structure under one national organisation that continued to operate the same high street showrooms under the same basic model. A place where you could pay your quarterly bill in person, inquire about a service contract, and be shown the range of current gas appliances by someone whose job was to make the case for gas as the better choice. The North Sea conversion had been the showroom's greatest period of business. Between 1967 and 1977, as the country switched region by region from manufactured town gas to natural gas piped from the offshore fields, every gas appliance in Britain required either conversion or replacement. Cookers, boilers, water heaters, gas fires, all of them had different burner settings for the new gas, and the Gas Board ran a program of visiting homes with engineers to convert compatible appliances and replacing the ones that could not be adapted. The showroom was where you went when you wanted to know what was available to replace the old cooker that the engineer had condemned, and what the new one would cost, and whether you could have it on the board's own rental scheme, which offered the appliance and a service contract together for a fixed weekly payment in the manner the television rental companies had pioneered. The Gas Board had been offering appliance rental to customers for decades, and the conversion program gave that offer a new relevance for several million households simultaneously. The showroom salesperson understood the appliances in detail because her job required it. A customer asking about the difference between a balanced flue boiler and an open flue system was a customer who needed a technical answer, not a brochure, and the salesperson who could give it accurately and without condescension was the one who completed the sale. The Gas Board invested in product training for its showroom staff in a way that distinguished the role from general retail work. The uniform helped signal that this was a representative of the National Supply Authority, not a commission agent, and the reassurance that produced was part of what the showroom sold, alongside the appliances themselves. You trusted the Gas Board the way you trusted the post office, because both of them were simply there, permanent and accountable, in a way that the market of private alternatives was not yet. Privatization changed the character of the institution without immediately dismantling it. The Gas Act of 1986 converted the British Gas Corporation into British Gas plc, floated on the London Stock Exchange on the 8th of December that year at 135 pence per share, valuing the company at £9 billion. The Tell Sid advertising campaign, which urged the public to buy shares through a series of television advertisements showing the message being passed between ordinary people, reached 3 million individual shareholders. The showrooms continued operating under private ownership, but the commercial logic that governed them was different from the logic of a nationalized board, whose mandate was to connect the country to the gas supply, rather than to maximize margin. Competition arrived in the domestic supply market through the 1990s, and with it, the calculation that a high street property portfolio was an expensive way to serve customers who could be reached more cheaply by phone and later online. The showrooms closed progressively through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The quarterly bill that had brought you through the door could be paid by direct debit. The appliance you might have discussed with a uniformed salesperson could be researched on a website and ordered from an independent retailer. The specific combination of functions the showroom had provided, bill payment and product advice and service inquiry all in one room on the high street, staffed by someone who represented the whole organization, had no equivalent that replaced it in any direct sense. It simply stopped being available. That is how most of these 21 jobs ended. Not with a decision that this particular thing was finished, but with a gradual accumulation of alternatives that made the original arrangement seem, one year and then the next, slightly less necessary than it had been. And then one day, you went to the place where it had been and found something else there, and realized you had not noticed the departure because you had already adjusted to its absence without knowing you had done so. All of it was happening around you. You were just getting on with things, the way you always had. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.